Something massive is happening right now, and most Americans have no idea how deep it goes. The war that the United States and Israel launched against Iran on February 28, 2026, is not just a military operation in some distant desert. It is a hinge moment in history, the kind that restructures civilizations, redirects the flow of money, and reshuffles who holds power on this planet for the next 100 years. And here is the brutal irony that Washington's strategists seem to have missed entirely. In attempting to raise the United States over China, they may have paradoxically raised China up in power. That is not a talking point from Beijing. That is the quiet, devastating conclusion emerging from the facts on the ground right now in real time. Let's sit with that for a moment because it deserves your full attention. On February 28, 2026, Israel and the United States carried out coordinated strikes on Iran, targeting leadership sites, military forces, and nuclear and ballistic missile infrastructure. Within days, global energy markets became extremely volatile, with Brent crude soaring to a peak of $119.50 on March 9, 2026, as the closure of the Strait of Hormuz threatened 20% of global supply. And that narrow ribbon of water between Iran and Oman is not just an oil passage, it is the jugular vein of the global economy. When it closes, the whole world feels it, not just at the pump, not just in airline tickets, in everything, in the bread on your table, in the fertilizer that grows your food, in the plastics that wrap every product you buy. The International Energy Agency described this as the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. Now, here is where it gets deeply historically significant. While Iran shut down the Strait of Hormuz, it made one critical exception. Tehran announced that Chinese tankers are allowed to pass through the oil transit choke point unimpeded. Read that again. In the middle of the most catastrophic energy disruption in recorded history, China was handed a golden key. Every ship wanting to move oil through the world's most important choke point now has to negotiate with Tehran. And an Iranian government official told CNN that tankers can have permission to travel through the Strait of Hormuz if they agree to sell oil in China's currency, the renminbi, not US dollars. This is not a footnote. This is a tectonic shift in the architecture of global power. Think about what that means. The petrodollar system, the arrangement by which global oil has been traded exclusively in American dollars since the 1970s, is the financial spine of American empire. It is the reason the United States can run enormous deficits, print money, and still have the world come back asking for more. Every time someone buys oil anywhere on the planet, they need dollars to do it. That creates a permanent structural global demand for the US dollar. It is the invisible tax that the rest of the world pays to America simply for the privilege of accessing energy. And right now, Iran is forthrightly confronting this system, using its geopolitical leverage over the Strait of Hormuz and the global oil trade to challenge the petrodollar. Iran, a country with a defense budget that is roughly 1% of America's military spending, has found the Achilles heel of the most powerful empire the world has ever seen. The United States president has repeatedly said, "We don't use the strait, we don't need it," citing the fact that the US is a net exporter of oil. But that argument misses the point so completely, it is almost embarrassing. The United States does not need the strait for its own oil supply. What America desperately needs is for global oil to keep being priced in dollars. The moment that changes, the moment enough countries start settling energy transactions in yuan or in any currency other than dollars, the financial gravity that holds American power together begins to dissolve. And that process is happening right now, not in some future scenario analysts have been warning about for decades. It is happening today in March 2026 in the Persian Gulf. China, which imports around 40% of its oil from the Middle East, had stockpiled crude before the war, allowing it to tap on its 1.4 billion barrels of crude in strategic storage. China saw this coming, or at least prepared as if it did. While the rest of Asia is scrambling, India facing inflation, Japan facing supply shocks, South Korea staring at disrupted trade routes, Beijing is sitting relatively steady on its reserves, getting discounted oil through its special arrangement with Iran, and watching the yuan inch its way toward becoming the currency of energy in the Gulf. In 2025 alone, Chinese refiners purchased roughly 1.38 million barrels of Iranian oil per day, making China the largest consumer of Iran's crude, with estimates suggesting that more than 80 to 90% of Iran's oil exports now go to China. This did not happen by accident. This is the result of years of patient, deliberate strategy by Beijing. And the strategy has multiple dimensions that go beyond oil. The alliance between China and Iran is founded on extensive geopolitical interests. Iran is a pivotal ally in China's Belt and Road Initiative, a significant energy provider and a crucial geopolitical counterbalance to US dominance in the Middle East. The BRI, that vast infrastructure network connecting Asia, Africa, and Europe that many American commentators dismissed for years as an overambitious vanity project, is quietly becoming the alternative spine of global commerce. While Washington has been spending trillions on military operations in the Middle East, over the past 2 decades, Beijing has been spending on ports, roads, railways, fiber optic cables, and energy pipelines. One builds presence through bombs. The other builds presence through contracts. History has a verdict on which one lasts longer. Now let us talk about what is happening at the diplomatic level, because this is where the story gets even more extraordinary. Middle powers have adopted a careful strategy of hedging, increasingly seeking a balance to US unilateralism in 2026 by looking towards China and Russia. This is not a marginal trend. This is the mainstream behavior of the global South right now. Countries that used to align quietly with Washington are now hedging. They are not going full Beijing. They are too pragmatic for that, but they are diversifying their loyalties in ways that would have been unthinkable just 10 years ago. And every time Washington deploys military force unilaterally, every time it imposes sanctions without UN authorization, every time it tells the world to follow its rules while breaking them itself, it accelerates this drift. The economic architecture of the conflict exposes a fundamental contradiction. The United States has imposed enormous costs on many of the same economies it relies on as trading and strategic partners. Look at the European Union. Since Liberation Day, the day the US president declared large unilateral tariffs on every nation in the world, the EU has concluded that China is a more reliable counterpart for trade agreements than the United States, who is unleashing bedlam. Trade between the EU and China surged in the first 2 months of 2026. The European Union and China, two powers that have had serious friction over trade practices, human rights, and technology, are drawing closer together because both of them are being pushed by American economic aggression. That is a remarkable development. That is the kind of geopolitical realignment that normally takes generations. It is being compressed into months. China is gradually increasing its political and security engagement in the Middle East region, driven by growing economic interactions, albeit at a slow but steady pace. The key word there is steady. China does not do things in dramatic bursts the way American foreign policy tends to lurch from crisis to crisis. China operates on timelines that stretch across decades. While Washington changes strategy every 4 years with each election cycle, Beijing maintains a consistent long-game orientation that is almost geological in its patience. And that patience is paying dividends right now in the middle of this war in ways that are measurable and real. Consider the intelligence dimension of this conflict. China's technology collaboration with Iran, especially in space-based information and navigation systems, may facilitate Iran's ability to execute precision warfare while circumventing direct military engagement. China is not putting boots on the ground. China is not flying combat missions over the Persian Gulf. But through satellite intelligence, Beidou navigation systems, advanced radar networks, and electronic warfare capabilities shared with Iran, Beijing is able to observe American and Israeli military systems operating in real combat conditions, gathering intelligence on Western weapons, tactics, and vulnerabilities without taking a single casualty. China secures the chance to analyze Western military systems in practical scenarios, and that knowledge will shape how China designs its own military doctrine and weapon systems for years to come. America is, in a very real sense, field testing its military for China's benefit. Now let us talk about the broader economic damage this war is inflicting, not on Iran, not on the Middle East, but on the United States itself and its allies. The war's cascading economic fallout is now radiating well beyond the Gulf, reshaping global commodity markets, food systems, industrial supply chains, financial conditions, and geopolitical alignments, potentially for years to come. This is not a contained regional conflict. The shockwaves are hitting everywhere. The war is already complicating monetary policy decision-making as economists in countries as far from the battlefield as Chile and Poland scale back expectations for rate cuts as oil prices rise and uncertainty deepens. Think about that. A war in the Persian Gulf is affecting interest rate decisions in South America and Eastern Europe. That is how interconnected this world is. And every ripple of economic pain that this conflict generates is a ripple that weakens the credibility of American leadership, because America started it. The United States is itself unwinding its own global order. That is not an anti-American statement. That is an observation from one of the most respected geopolitical risk firms on the planet. The rules-based international order, the system of institutions, alliances, and norms that America built after World War II and that served as the foundation of American global dominance for 80 years, is being dismantled not by China, not by Russia, not by some external adversary. It is being dismantled from the inside. The national security strategy makes the US retreat from primacy official. The days of the United States propping up the entire world order like Atlas are over. When a country officially declares in its own national security documents that it is retreating from global leadership, the world takes note, and the world begins making other arrangements. China is making other arrangements. Russia is making other arrangements. The global South is making other arrangements. The battlefield of the 21st century is not only defined by missiles and drones, but also by currencies, trade networks, and financial alliances. And on that battlefield, the battlefield that actually determines whether empires rise or fall over the long arc of history, China is gaining ground while America bleeds treasure and credibility in the Gulf. Here is what the American public deserves to understand about the deeper logic of this moment. The 2026 Iran war exposes China's energy vulnerabilities, but simultaneously creates strategic space for Beijing to expand diplomatic influence, recalibrate partnerships, and advance its position within a shifting global order. China is not without its own pressures and contradictions in this scenario. Beijing imports massive quantities of oil from the Middle East, and disruptions to that flow hurt China's industrial production and growth targets. Despite massive economic investments and deep political ties, Beijing was unable to shield Tehran from either the 2025 or 2026 US-Israel attacks, exposing the limits of its cautious approach to regional security. China has limits, China has vulnerabilities, but the difference between China's position and America's position right now is that China's vulnerabilities are being managed while America's are being compounded. Every week this war continues. The damage to American economic interests, to American credibility, to American alliances, to the American-dominated financial system accumulates faster than the strategic gains. Washington's effort to retain strategic control over global energy flows amid rising competition with China was one of the core strategic rationales for these strikes. But the execution has been so damaging to American interests that the strategy is now producing the opposite of its intended result. Rather than cementing American control over Middle Eastern energy flows, the war has handed Iran, and through Iran, China, enormous leverage over those very flows. The Strait of Hormuz, which American naval power was supposed to guarantee as an open waterway for global commerce, is now effectively an Iranian toll booth where Chinese flags get a free pass and UN-denominated transactions get preferential treatment. This is a stunning reversal of the strategic logic that underpinned American Middle East policy for 50 years. As the US president issues threats, several governments, including India, Pakistan, Iraq, Malaysia, China, and Japan, are in talks with Tehran to negotiate passage through the Strait of Hormuz. Reportedly, at least 9 ships have already used the new de facto safe shipping corridor, and Iran is in the process of creating a more formal approval process. The world is not waiting for Washington to solve this. The world is working around Washington. Countries that depend on Gulf energy, which is to say most of the world, are quietly establishing new relationships, new payment systems, and new diplomatic channels that bypass the American-dominated financial architecture entirely. And once those channels are established, once those habits are formed, they do not simply disappear when the shooting stops. They become the new normal. China's near total control over many critical minerals and rare earth elements, and Beijing's willingness to weaponize that dominance put the world on notice. Add to that China's preferential access to Gulf energy during a global supply crisis, the growing yuan-denominated oil trade, the surge in EU-China trade, the Belt and Road infrastructure threading through dozens of countries, and the intelligence advantages gained from observing American and Israeli military operations in Iran. And you have a picture of a country that is advancing on multiple fronts simultaneously, while its rival is consumed by an expensive, strategically counterproductive war in the desert. The morality of this moment matters too, and Americans should not shy away from asking the hard questions. The assassination of Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei in the opening strikes of this war represents the kind of act that carries consequences far beyond the immediate military moment. It tells every government in the world, every leader who is not firmly inside the American alliance structure, that sovereignty is conditional, that leadership is a target, and that international law is a convenience America invokes when useful and ignores when not. And that message is not lost on Beijing. It reinforces every argument China makes to the global South about the nature of American power. It hands Beijing a moral cudgel that it will wield in diplomatic forums for years. Iran's strategy of using its geopolitical leverage over the Strait of Hormuz and the global oil trade to challenge the petrodollar reflects a deeper aspiration: the crafting of a post-war world, a new world order, where there is a multipolar financial system, where the dollar is no longer the single currency that rules the world. That vision of a multipolar financial world where American economic coercion loses its teeth is not just Iran's vision, it is China's vision, it is Russia's vision. It is increasingly the vision of dozens of countries in Africa, Latin America, and Asia that have grown exhausted by decades of American sanctions, American conditionality, American lectures about democracy from a government that overthrows democracies when they produce the wrong result. The war in Iran is not creating this vision. The war is accelerating a vision that already existed, giving it urgency, giving it momentum, giving it a concrete mechanism in the form of yuan-denominated oil transactions at the Strait of Hormuz. What happens next is genuinely uncertain. Wars have a way of producing outcomes that none of the parties intended. But what is certain is that the geopolitical landscape that emerges from this conflict will look different from the one that preceded February 28th, 2026. The longer this war runs, the more lasting the damage becomes. And the damage is not symmetrical. America's allies are hurting. America's credibility is bleeding. America's financial architecture is under direct challenge, and Beijing is watching and calculating and patiently positioning itself to inherit the influence that American overreach is surrendering. This is not the story most Americans are being told, but it is the story that is actually unfolding, and you needed to know it.